Chapter 10. Frank. Frank didn't remember much about the funeral itself, but he remembered the hours leading up to it. His grandmother coming out of the backyard to find him shooting arrows at her porcelain collection. His grandmother's house was a rambling gray stone mansion on 12 acres across North Vancouver. Her backyard ran straight into Lynn Canyon Park. The morning was cold and drizzly, but Frank didn't feel the chill. He wore a black wool suit and a black overcoat that had once belonged to his grandfather. Frank had been startled and upset to find they fit him fine. The clothes smelled like wet mothballs and jasmine. The fabric was itchy but warm. With his bow and quiver, he probably looked like a very dangerous butler. He looked at some of his grandmother's porcelain in the wagon. He toted it into the yard, where he'd set up the targets on old fence posts at the edge of the property. He'd been shooting for so long, his fingers were starting to lose their feeling. With every arrow, he imagined he was striking down his problems. Snipers in Afghanistan. Smash! A teapot exploded with an arrow through the middle. The sacrifice medal, a silver disc on red and black ribbon, giving for death in the line of duty, presented to Frank as if it were something important, something that made everything all right. Thwack! A teacup spun into the woods. The officer who came to tell him, "Your mother's a hero. Captain Emily Zhang died trying to save her comrades." Crack! A blue and white plate split into pieces. His grandmother's chastisement. "Men do not cry, especially Zhang men. You will endure, Phi." No one called him Phi except for his grandmother. "What sort of name is Frank?" she would scold. "That is not a Chinese name." "I'm not Chinese," Frank thought, but he didn't dare say that. His mother had told him years ago there is no arguing with his grandmother. It'll only make you suffer worse. She'd been right, and now Frank had no one except his grandmother. Thud! A fourth arrow hit the fence post and stuck there, quivering. "Phi!" his grandmother said. Frank turned. She was clutching a shoebox-sized mahogany chest that Frank had never seen before. With her high-collared black dress and severe bun of gray hair, she looked like a schoolteacher from the 1800s. She surveyed the carnage. Her porcelain in the wagon, the shards of her favorite tea set scattered out on the lawn, Frank's arrow sticking out of the ground, the trees, the fence posts, and the one that hit the head of a smiling gardening gnome. Frank thought she would yell, or hit him with the box. He'd never done anything this bad before. He'd never felt so angry. His grandmother's face was full of bitterness and disapproval. She looked nothing like Frank's mom. He wondered how his mother had turned out to be so nice, always laughing, always gentle. Frank couldn't imagine his mom growing up with a grandmother any more than he could imagine her on the battlefield. Though the two situations probably weren't that different. He waited for grandmother to explode. Maybe he'd be grounded and wouldn't have to go to the funeral. He wanted to hurt her for being so mean all the time, for letting his mother go off to war, for scolding him to get over it. All she cared about was her stupid collection. "Stop this ridiculous behavior," grandmother said. She didn't sound very irritated. "It's beneath you." To Frank's astonishment, she kicked aside one of her favorite teacups. "The car will be here soon," she said. "We must talk." Frank was dumbfounded. He looked more closely at the mahogany box. For a horrible moment, he wondered if it contained his mother's ashes. But that was impossible. Grandmother had told him that there would be a military burial. Then why did grandmother hold the box so gingerly, as if its contents grieved her? "Come inside," she said. Without waiting to see if he would follow, she turned and marched towards the house. In the parlor, Frank sat on a velvet sofa surrounded by vintage family photos, porcelain vases that had been too large for his wagon, and red Chinese calligraphy banners. Frank didn't know what the calligraphy said. He'd never had much interest in learning. He didn't know what most of the people in the photographs were either. Whenever grandmother started lecturing him about his ancestors, how they'd come over from China and prospered in the export-import business, eventually becoming one of the wealthiest Chinese families in Vancouver, well, it was boring. Frank was fourth-generation Canadian. He didn't care about China and all those musty antiques. The only Chinese characters he could recognize were his family name, Zhang, Master of Bows. That was cool. Grandmother sat next to him, her posture stiff, her hands folded over the box. "Your mother wanted you to have these," she said with reluctance. "She kept it since you were a baby. When she went away to war, she entrusted it to me. But now she is gone, and soon you will be going too." Frank's stomach fluttered. "Going? Where?" "I am old," grandmother said, as if it were a surprising announcement. "I have my own appointment with death, soon enough. I cannot teach you the skills you will need, and I cannot keep this burden. If something would happen to it, I would never forgive myself. You would die.